Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Scrutiny of the laws that we make and that bind us is very important. It is exceedingly important when the origins of the laws are not within our own parliamentary framework. And of course, the part of the United Kingdom from which I come, Northern Ireland, is an area where in over 300 areas of law, the laws are not made by this House, they're not made by the Stormont Assembly, they're made by a foreign parliament that we don't elect, the European Parliament. And therefore, when it comes to scrutiny, that underscores the huge importance of scrutiny being effective. And insofar as this motion moves to slightly improve the situation, that's welcome. But there are a couple of 3 or 4 points I do need to make about this. Is the inference of this motion that there has been no scrutiny of these matters since the demise of the European Scrutiny Committee in or about April of last year? And if that is so, then obviously there's been a vast swathe of laws which have gone unscrutinised. The former chairman of the European Scrutiny Committee told this House in March 23 that in the 2 years from 21 to 23 there have been 620 EU laws imposed on Northern Ireland. How many have been imposed since? How many of them have been scrutinised? And since Northern Ireland is the region most affected by many of these laws, then I do have to register, Madam Deputy Speaker, disappointment that there isn't a single member from Northern Ireland proposed on the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. That seems to me to be a huge failure in respect of giving some confidence to those I represent and the part of the United Kingdom from which I come that scrutiny is taking place and is effective. Third point is one. Yes,
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. As someone who sat on the European Scrutiny Committee in the last Parliament, does the honourable gentleman agree with me that it's no surprise that the now Labour government don't want to scrutinise this legislation coming from the European Union, because for much of the last Parliament, with the exception of the former member for Dagenham, John Cruddas, the Labour members of the former European Scrutiny Committee literally never turned up?
I hear what the right honourable gentleman says, and I don't gainsay what he says, and if that is so, then it is a very poor reflection on the interest in scrutiny. So not only have we this lacuna where there has been a year or more of no scrutiny in respect of these matters, but we also have the very unsatisfactory position of there being no transparency. There is no public list of all the imposed EU laws. It doesn't exist, from what I'm told. Now, how can it be right that citizens in any part of this United Kingdom can be governed by laws of which there isn't even a list of what all those laws are? So I would be looking to the government for a commitment that going forward there at least will be the transparency of publishing a list of all relevant regulations which are imposed, and that is the correct word, imposed on Northern Ireland from a foreign parliament. Now some might say, oh, but doesn't the Stormont Assembly have a democratic scrutiny committee? Of sorts it does. But on the 2nd of February this year, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland wrote to the Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly informing him of the types of laws that would be reported to the Assembly, and it does not include all laws. We have the Stormont break, so-called. It applies only to any amending law of an existing EU law. We have the applicability motion. It applies to any new law. But we do not have any right of scrutiny within the Northern Ireland Assembly of what we would call statutory instruments. There simply is no capacity to scrutinise it. And we've recently had a quite troubling example of such a statutory instrument. Commission Implementing Regulation 2025-89. For the first time in any part of this United Kingdom, created the situation where, with no consultation with our consumers, with no consultation with our elected representatives, we now have an authorised EU law whereby mealworm and insects can be included in food products. An EU law which has been imposed upon Northern Ireland without any scrutiny in Stormont or in this place. So I do ask this question: is this the type of EU implementing regulation which would be on the agenda of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee? Or would it just pass under the radar, as has been happening for so long? And of course, there is a vast swathe of law which are very important, which, because under the protocol arrangements, they are not what could be classified as devolved issues, which are never scrutinised, nor can ever be scrutinised within the Northern Ireland Assembly. Anything that arises under the EU's customs code, anything that arises under its VAT regime, anything that arises under state aid, none of those issues are devolved issues. They are reserved issues to this place. There are regulations made from time to time on customs code, and the customs code, of course, is the most offensive of all the protocol arrangements, because it is the one that says Northern Ireland is to be treated as EU territory, GB is to be treated as a third or foreign country, and thus the goods coming from GB to Northern Ireland, coming from a third country, have to be subject to the rigours of an international customs border. All that arises under the EU's customs code, and none of that can be scrutinised in Northern Ireland, and none of it has been being scrutinised in this House either. Yes?
I thank the honourable member for giving way. On the issue of the lack of scrutiny, would he agree with me that as time goes on now and the American administration begin to look at what they may or may not do vis-a-vis the EU in terms of trading arrangements, it's all the more important, it was important anyway, but even more important now that we have close scrutiny because of potential deals that may come about between the American administration, the UK and possibly the EU?
Yes, and there is much, I'm grateful, there is much talk about tariffs. Yes. And think of the conundrum that would be created if President Trump imposed tariffs on the EU. Northern Ireland, treated as EU territory, would, I presume, be subject to those tariffs. Yet we're told we're part of the United Kingdom. And all that because of the application to Northern Ireland of the Customs Code, and if therefore there were corresponding responses from the EU to that scenario, under adjustments to or matters arising under its Customs Code, they too, it seems, would apply to Northern Ireland, and all that without scrutiny. So I do think that whereas the establishment of this committee, belated as it is welcome, it is important to understand that it will seriously address the scrutiny issues, as the previous committee under Sir Bill Cash did do, and I pay tribute to the work they did. But there has been this great gap in the meantime of no scrutiny effectively whatsoever. And now under a committee, as I've made the point, without even a Northern Ireland representative upon it. Yes?
Would you accept that even when we had the European Scrutiny Committee, which was able to exclusively deal with these kinds of issues, that there were many, many EU regulations which did not have the opportunity to discuss them, and given the importance of this, not just to Northern Ireland, but as the members pointed out, to the whole of the United Kingdom, that to allow this kind of thing to develop leaves us very, very vulnerable to changes in laws which could be detrimental and which don't actually get enough examination in this House?
Absolutely. The sheer volume of EU law which still applies in Northern Ireland. You have in Annex 2 of the protocol 287 areas of law, many added to it since. So all of that breeds further regulation of a huge quantity, and yet the lack of scrutiny and the speed with which it is applied and the lack of opportunity for scrutiny is important. And one of the complaints I hear from the European Scrutiny Committee in the Northern Ireland Assembly is that they aren't given the time or notice to deal with issues, even if there were the inclination amongst some to deal with them. Yes,
it's even worse than that. On occasions, the regulations have gone through, been adopted before they even know that the regulation is there.
Yeah, and the Cabinet Office undertakes to notify on a weekly basis, but I think frankly that is honoured more in default than in anything else. So we are in a very, from a point of view of scrutiny position, a very perilous position. I do hope this committee will grasp this issue. I do hope they will take it seriously, and my only regret is there isn't a member from Northern Ireland on that committee to hold their feet to the fire on this particular issue. But it does go to the heart of what should affect and concern us all as representatives. And I do say to members of this House who come from other parts of the United Kingdom, how would they feel if 300 areas of law they couldn't make, couldn't change, and the regulations which flowed from them weren't even being properly scrutinised? I think we know how others would feel. Well, frankly, we ask for nothing that others don't have for themselves. Thank you.